This video is part 2 of a 3-part series. You will find the link to part 1 in the description. And this video is also sponsored by the folks over at Surfshark VPN. If you're looking for a VPN service and happen to also want to support this channel, you can do so by going to the description and clicking the link I left there, or typing into your browser surfshark.deals/Kraut. Why use Surfshark VPN? Well, for one, they are more affordable than other VPNs. They also have a strict no-logs policy, meaning none of your online activity will be logged. But first and foremost, they protect your identity while online. Using a VPN will protect you from people with malicious intentions who try to harm you by exposing your IP address or other sensitive information. Second, the data you send online will be encrypted, which means not even your provider will be able to see what you are doing on the internet, and sites will not be throttled by your provider. Third, you can use a VPN to bypass regional restrictions. If you live in a country that blocks certain YouTube videos, you can use a VPN to still watch them. If you want to watch a show on Netflix or Disney Plus that is only available in Canada, you can basically pretend to be Canadian with a VPN and still watch that show. As you can see here on my Chromebook, it is easy to switch between countries, and as you can see here with the app on my desktop, the process is just as simple. And yes, as you can see, you can use Surfshark on as many devices as you like. An unlimited number of devices can be connected to one Surfshark account. Fourth, you can use a VPN to see different prices for different things based on where your IP address is located. Some online vendors sell services and products at different prices in some countries than they may do in yours. Through the use of a VPN, it will be possible for you to compare prices around the world and make better purchases. This is especially useful when buying airfare. And fifth, Surfshark VPN blocks out ads and malware while you browse the internet. These are my 5 reasons for why I use Surfshark VPN, but there are more reasons that you can read about on their website. A link to it will be in the description. If you are interested and you also want to support this channel, click the link in the description or go to surfshark.deals/Kraut or use the code Kraut to get 83% off a 2-year plan and 3 extra months for free. There's also a 30-day money-back guarantee if you want to convince yourself of this product first. Many thanks again to the folks over at Surfshark VPN for sponsoring this video. All the proceeds from this sponsorship will go to paying artists who contributed artwork for this video. And speaking of which, let's go and watch it. The 1800s were a century of American expansion, collectively known under the term Manifest Destiny, a 19th century socio-political movement originating in New England, its main claim being that the United States had an obligation to expand across the entire North American continent to spread its way of life and social structure. We associate this term mainly with the time period of the 1840s, when starting from New England, more and more American settlers pushed westward to settle. The Mexican-American War took place, as well as the American annexation of Mexican territory north of the Rio Grande, and the American wars with natives flared up as the US government enforced the program of ethnic cleansing. However, I find this to oversimplify the story of American expansion westward. When the story of Manifest Destiny is told, particularly in popular history, it is often done in a way that can make people think this was the one big and only expansion of territory by the Americans, or that American territory didn't expand before, or that American expansionism only came from New England. And that is simply not true. From the first moment of settlers arriving on the coastlines of North America, there had been expansions westward. The British had even banned further expansion to keep treaties with the Cherokee. But after the British were gone, there was nothing holding the Americans back. After the founding of the first settlements, there were 11 big internal expansions through migrations by settlers into frontier countries in North America. One of the first was Appalachia. When Britain exported Scots and Scottish penal labour into the New World, these didn't like sticking around the predominantly English colonies, so they ran off into the then hard-to-reach frontier of the Appalachian Mountains, founding their own settlements, towns and social structures that would become the modern-day states of West Virginia, Kentucky and Tennessee. As soon as the British were gone, there were 3 big migrations westward between 1780 and 1840. From New England, settlers pushed westward from upstate New York along the Great Lakes, bringing with them their social structures in attempts to expand their way of life and society westward. Ships carrying these settlers along the Great Lakes had names like the Mayflower of the West, and they would chase away the Iroquois to found new settlements along northern Pennsylvania, northern Ohio, northern Indiana, and northern Illinois, northern Wisconsin, and basically the entire state of Michigan. You can see when New Englanders settled in places like the Ohio Valley by the names given to these towns that often resembled the names of towns in Massachusetts, Connecticut, and New York, or even Old World England itself, like Bristol, Danbury, Fairfield, Greenwich, Guilford, Hartford, Litchfield, New Haven, New London, or Norwalk. Fourth, the earliest European settlers of Appalachia tended to live in small farms and drive their herds of pigs, sheep, and cattle from field to field until the soil had been depleted. Then they abandoned that farm, moved to the next patch of land, and started over again. Starting in the 1800s, these Appalachians started to quickly expand westward from the mountains into the Ohio Valley and down the Mississippi Valley. They spread and settled in the south in northern Georgia, northern Alabama, and northern Mississippi, north into southern Ohio, southern Indiana, and southern Illinois, and west into Iowa, Missouri, Kansas, Arkansas, and by the 1840s into northern Texas. Natives, be they Cherokee, Chickasaw, or whoever the Appalachians encountered, were driven off to make way, creating a large cultural sphere of states whose inhabitants some today just call redneck. Fifth, from 1810 onward, Europe was a tinderbox of constantly flaring revolutionary flames. One place where these fires kept flaring up over and over again was Germany. However, all revolutions that flared up in Germany failed, including the big one in 1848. With absolute monarchy ever deeply entrenching itself in Germany, tens of thousands of disillusioned Germans from Prussia to Poland to the Rhineland, Bavaria, Czechia, and Austria packed and left for America starting in the 1820s. And they were encouraged to do so by German governments glad to rid themselves of potential troublemakers. These Germans would usually migrate east of Philadelphia throughout western Pennsylvania and central Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Illinois, Minnesota, and Wisconsin. They brought with them their social structure of semi-independent small family-owned farms and family businesses and created the cultural framework for what became the Midwest. You can see the impact these first free westward migrations had in modern politics to this day. The coastlines of the Great Lakes, mainly settled by people from New England, tend to vote Democratic. The southern parts, mainly settled by Appalachians, tend to vote Republican. And the parts settled by Germans can vote both ways and are what make these places swing in elections. Sixth, by the 1810s, the slave lords of the South ran into a problem. They had run out of land to expand their plantations. New England politicians had constantly blocked any attempt by southern states to expand slavery westward. But by the 1820s, they gained the political power to expand west, and by 1829 had a president in the White House who was sympathetic to their cause. The Cherokee, Creek, and Choctaw were driven off their lands with the not-so-subtly named Indian Removal Act to make way for southern slave plantations in Georgia, Alabama, Florida, and Mississippi. And when these plantation owners expanded into Louisiana, they encountered and were disgusted by the local colonial French towns, where over 50% of all blacks were free, where free black Frenchmen could rise to a high social status, and where interracial marriages had never been illegal and were widely practiced. So they forced their way of life upon them from this point onward. What we see here with this southern westward expansion is that westward expansion not only meant the removal of native Indians, but also the removal and forcing yourself upon other colonial European societies. With this southern expansion, we reach the 1840s, where in popular history many claim that the era of manifest destiny began. As you clearly saw, the push westward happened more than half a century before, even under British colonial rule. And more importantly, I left out the first expansions of settlements, one that is often ignored, overlooked, or forgotten in the story of North America, the Spanish and later Mexican push north. The Spanish settlers who settled from California to Texas and founded a distinctive culture decades before American expansions. 1776 is widely remembered as the year the American Revolution began, but we should not forget that 1776 is also the same year that the Spanish founded San Francisco. Here lies probably one of the main reasons why the year 1840 is so significant to what Americans call manifest destiny, because it collided with someone else's destiny. Of course, previous expansions had collided with the destinies of many peoples: Cherokee, Iroquois, Creek, Choctaw, and many more, a people defined as savage and unworthy of the land they lived upon by those who came to take it away from them. But west of Oklahoma and the Sabine River, there now was another European nation and culture, a nation that had expanded north, had itself taken land from the Apaches, Huaxiltecan, Pueblo, Navajo, and Comanche. A nation that saw it as its own manifest destiny to go north and to expand, build, and prosper as a society. Expanding westward now meant clashing with another European state society, and with a different vision of society. It would no longer just be a drive to grab and take from peoples considered inferior, but a contest with a state over which one was more worthy or strong enough to take these lands. In many ways a common theme of imperialism during that era, when Britain challenged the Mughals for rule over India and France challenged the Ottomans for rule over North Africa at the same time. Conflict between Mexico and America over these lands would mean an imperial war of expansion. However, there's also an additional reason why 1840 stands out to us, and that has to do with the internal politics of both these places at the time. In the United States, the two predominant political forces at the time were those of the New England North with its Midwest ally and the South with its Appalachian ally, fighting over the one preeminent political issue of the time: slavery. It was not just New England that expanded west, but also the South, and they did so for the same reason: to form free states and slave states, to have more states than the other, to dominate over the other, to either abolish slavery or reinforce and expand slavery. A political confrontation that eventually blew up into a full-blown civil war. Here, in the context of this internal political conflict and encountering Mexico, is where the 9th and 10th big migration waves came into the picture. In the north, people from the Midwest and New England migrated into Oregon and California, intending to build a New England of the West Coast. The native Chinook people of Oregon, when first encountering white people, started calling them Bostoners, because so many settlers came from Boston. The names of their settlements, such as Salem, named after a town of the same name in Massachusetts, or Portland, named after a town of the same name in Maine, clearly show how these first American settlers in Oregon and California were from New England. However, in California, they were unclaimed land and needed a justification for violating the Spanish and later Mexican claims, which the Protestant New Englanders did by declaring the migrations there as a war against the popish Catholic tyranny of Spain, and to bring the true virtuous Protestant faith to these lands. Early American settlers in California converted to Catholicism and adopted Mexican citizenship. But as the decades rolled on, more and more New England settlers brought with them a refusal to adopt any such thing. They started building public schools and Protestant churches. They lived in disobedience of the already weak state authority of the Californian state, and, as the years went by, more and more openly claimed that California ought to be part of the United States. And at the same time in Texas, Southerners started to arrive with slaves to turn it into a slave state. As the large landowners, bankers, generals, and mine owners kept bickering and scheming over the power and riches of the country in Mexico City, and the authority of the state increasingly started to decline, the two places it lost the most control over were Alta California and Texas. The Norteños increasingly lived their lives by themselves and gave less and less of a damn about what those bickering fools in Mexico City told them to do, especially after caravans with supplies stopped being sent north from Mexico City. What was sent north by Mexico City was often counterproductive to asserting control, such as penal laborers who kept escaping, laws that discriminated religious minorities and groups such as the Franciscans, ordering them expelled from the country, which the governor of Alta California refused to enforce, and which couldn't really be enforced in Texas, where government authority didn't have much of a reach anymore. Mexican soldiers who were sent to Texas and California to secure it for Mexico City often stopped getting paid aid by Mexico City and even stopped receiving basic supplies and rations, which resulted in entire companies deserting and entire battalions marauding through the lands, sacking and pillaging missions, churches, ranches, and towns. To top all that off, Mexico City passed a law that required a minimum annual income bracket for politicians. Congressmen had to have an annual income of at least 1,500 pesos to run for office. That's an annual income of $160,000 in today's money. And governors needed to earn at least 2,000 pesos a year to run for office, which is an annual income of $220,000 in today's money. This law secured the power of the wealthy elite in Mexico City, eliminated any public participation in politics, and ensured the country would remain an authoritarian oligarchy. But in the north, this law turned into an outright farce, because not a single person living in the lands stretching from the Bay of San Francisco to the Texas coastline earned enough money to be a governor, congressman, mayor, or even just a district deputy. In the north, nobody obeyed this law. People, in fact, stopped obeying most of Mexico City's laws. Mexico City, and Mexico by and large, started being seen as a nuisance and an obstruction in the lives of the Norteños. Tejano ranchers illegally drove their herds of cattle and fine-bred horses across the border into markets in Louisiana. Californios smuggled and sold their cow hides illegally in markets on the US frontier. Trading with foreigners was illegal, but nobody cared. And as the governor of California, Mariano Chico, noted,
"Necessity makes licit what is not licit by law. Without it, Californians would not exist."
As he had to admit that without breaking Mexico City's ridiculous laws, the economy and society of California would collapse into itself. Texas, in particular, increasingly slipped out of Mexico's control. Besides the fact that the Apaches didn't take kindly to anyone, Texas became increasingly pulled out of integration with Mexico. Internal integration is the extent to which a state entity can exert control over a region through infrastructure, administration, law, and trade. If you are a country, the extent to which you control that country is dependent upon how well you can access each part of this country, how much you can enforce your laws over these lands, and how well trade internally can be facilitated. The Norteños of Texas increasingly traded with the Americans. The road networks of the region had already been completely neglected, resulting in the roads and paths leading from Texas into Louisiana being better developed than those leading to Mexico City. Louisiana also had the nice big juicy port of New Orleans, through which Norteños could not only sell their products into the wider world, but could also access American markets through the vast Mississippi shipping lanes. And you also didn't have to bribe any oligarchs to do business in the United States. Texas gradually started to slip into an increasingly American economic sphere of influence. Americans also increasingly moved into Texas. By 1823, 3,000 of them lived there illegally, about as much as the Norteño population, and the government in Mexico City saw that as a good thing. Moses and Stephen Austin, a father and son team, had bought large land grants from the Mexican government right after independence, built a ranch, and over decades learned Spanish, acquired citizenship, and encouraged other Americans to do as they had. Mexico City believed that this would be the standard for American migration into Texas. They encouraged Americans to move to Texas, placed laws in effect that would demand of them to convert to Catholicism, and expected that these American settlers would help tame the Norteños and the Apaches and thereby restore control over Texas for Mexico City. They were, however, wrong. And this is also where myths started to be created. When you read popular history about what happened next, there are two versions of the story. The first is that a group of brave, pioneering Anglo-Americans liberated Texas for themselves. The other is that devious, white Anglo-Americans stole Texas from its Mexican inhabitants. Both narratives are wrong, one more wrong than the other. One is more self-limiting. Both oversimplify what happened. There are two main groups of American settlers who came to Texas. Appalachian Hill and Mountain people who settled in northern Texas to build small, self-sufficient communities within which they wanted to be as far away from New England and the South, as well as their governments, laws and regulations, as possible. And Southerners who settled along the Texas coastline who wanted to expand their slave plantations for profit and create a new slave state to expand their political power in their rivalry with New England. However, the majority of settlers were Southerners. These groups encountered and became neighbors of the Norteños. But rather than deeper tying the Norteños into Mexico, the Americans and Norteños found increasingly more common ground. They both couldn't stand the authoritarianism and attempts by Mexico City to control their lives. Norteños increasingly wished to liberate themselves from Mexico City's tyranny. The Southerners were by and large failed slave plantation owners running away from creditors and debt collectors from Louisiana to South Carolina. They didn't bother learning Spanish, certainly didn't convert to Catholicism, and imported slaves in violation of Mexico City's abolition of slavery. People like Hayden Edwards, who when he was reminded of Mexico's ban on slavery, declared himself independent in the Republic of Fredonia, where he legalized slavery. The Mexican army deported him back to Louisiana, however, the tide could not be stopped, and so, in 1830, Mexico banned immigration. But Americans kept coming, and Norteños supported them, as it brought the markets with which they were trading closer to them. Americans started outnumbering Norteños by 10-1, but both groups were not in conflict, but unified in opposition and open defiance against Mexico City. The Mexican perspective here, especially of the Tejanos, is often overlooked. The conflict between the North and South kept boiling, and all it would take for it to blow up was a spark, which came in 1833. When Santa Anna became president of Mexico again in 1833, he wanted to ensure that he would not be removed from power again. So he suspended the Mexican constitution, sent all his opponents into exile abroad, and seized complete power of all Mexican government institutions. Almost instantly, this led to rebellions all across Mexico, in Coahuila, Texas, New Mexico, and Alta California. California went so far as to declare independence, threatening to remain such until the Mexican Constitution had been restored. Pueblo Indians in New Mexico rose up in revolt, took Santa Fe, killed the governor, and declared a mestizo buffalo hunter to be their new governor. Santa Anna spent the first 2 years of this new presidency marching through northern Mexico with an army, crushing one rebellion after another with increasing brutality. Tejanos, angered by the move into absolute dictatorship, the previous decades of neglect and authoritarianism, and by Santa Anna's increasing brutality, had enough. They demanded at first for Texas to become a separate state from Coahuila, but to still remain part of Mexico. But support for that increasingly dissipated, and leading Norteños such as Juan Seguin, a friend of Stephen Austin, and Lorenzo de Zavala joined forces with separatist American settlers to demand complete independence from Mexico. At the Battle of the Alamo, 12 Tejanos were amongst the 200 fighting for an independent Texas. Lorenzo de Zavala would become the first vice president of Texas. Juan Seguin would lead Tejano rebels at the Battle of San Jacinto, the deciding battle that secured Texan independence and administered the burial of the dead after it. But it was already during the war where myth started to be created. Southern newspapers reported on this war as a conflict between white Anglo-Americans in a war against an inferior, mixed Hispanic race and their tyranny. Stephen Austin called the war
a war of barbarism and despotic principles waged by the mongrel Spanish, Indian, and Negro race against civilization and the Anglo-American race.
All of it lies through and through. Tejanos had risen up side by side with American settlers as Texans, primarily against Santa Anna's dictatorship. And when the revolution was over, the Norteños who had rebelled against Mexico City were betrayed. Southerners flooded into Texas to build new slave plantations along the coast, and the Norteños who had lived there were dispossessed and driven off the lands. Juan Seguin, who was elected the mayor of San Antonio in an independent Texas, was sent into exile after a rabble of southern newcomers accused him of being a Mexican spy. He returned years later after being proven innocent to discover in anger how Texas had been turned into a racially segregated society, with the Norteños restricted to the lands along the Rio Grande, and where none of them could hope to achieve any political representation or power within this new state.
At every hour of the day and night, my countrymen ran to me for protection against the assaults or exaction of those adventurers. Sometimes, by persuasion, I prevailed on them to desist. Sometimes, also, force had to be resorted to. How could I have done otherwise? Could I leave them defenseless, exposed to the assaults by foreigners who were on the pretext that they were Mexicans, treated them worse than brutes?
A powerful myth was born from these events, which became accepted historical fact for almost a century. A tale of brave southern pioneers who settled the land and freed it from Latin despotism. A tale that removed the story of the Norteño completely. And perplexingly, as we changed the way we tell history in the mid-20th century, a new counter-myth that called itself progressive was born, but was just as mythical. A tale of devious southern slave owners who stole the lands of Mexicans. A half-truth, but still therefore only half-true and half a lie. A tale that casts the Norteños as victims but doesn't acknowledge their participation in the rebellion and their dreams and hopes for freedom, and therefore falsely frames and omits the story of how those hopes and dreams were betrayed and crushed. The Norteños remained in the United States from Texas to California. Juan Seguin, upon returning to Texas, would become one of the first community organizers and leaders of Tejanos within the United States. In 1855, in the Galveston weekly newspaper, we find the first written record of a lynching of Mexicans. 11 Tejanos, the murder described and justified, mockingly, with the words,
"The whole race of Mexicans here is becoming a useless commodity, becoming cheap, dog cheap. 11 Mexicans, it is stated, have been found along the nooses in a hanged condition. Better so than to be left on the ground for the howling lobos to tear to pieces, and then howl the more for the red that burns his inside raw."
Lynchings of Tejanos continued up to the early 1900s. The land they had owned was grabbed not by small American settlers as in the West, but by large southern plantation owners from Virginia to South Carolina, Georgia, and Mississippi. In southern Texas, 1.3 million acres of land were acquired by only 13 southern planters. The land had previously been owned by 360 Tejanos, mostly small farmers and ranchers. These were driven off their lands and coerced into signing over their property under the threat of violence. The Stillman, King, and Kennedy ranches were such properties which were acquired through coercion, fraud, and threats of violence by Americans. If you were a wealthy Tejano rancher, you were also driven off your land unless you had a daughter and could find an American settler willing to marry her. The McAllen and Young ranches in southern Texas were acquired by American settlers that way. This disrupted but also weirdly reinforced the Norteño social structure with a patron at the center. In a way, the fundamental social structure remained the same. Mexican Texas had been a place of loose federal government control in which communities gathered and organized around the wealthiest member of the community, the patron. And American Texas also became a place of loose federal government control in which communities gathered and organized around the wealthiest members of the community, be they cattle barons, oil barons, or today's tech barons. In 1941, a certain Lyndon B. Johnson ran for the Senate in Texas and won 90% of the votes in the southern counties of Texas. He had won those votes not by campaigning but by calling George Parr, also known as the Duke of Duval County, and making him promises that in return got him the votes. The same counties had given 95% of the vote to Johnson's rival in the governor's race the year before. In 1948, when Johnson ran for the Senate seat again, he again called George Parr and received 99% of the votes in that county. These notorious elections are the result of a development within Texas and Tejano political culture after American annexations in northern Mexico that continued previous hierarchical structures. Tejanos lived in the United States, but they were exempt from political powers and economic institutions. They rebelled at first, such as in 1859 when Juan Cortina led a rebellion against Texan authorities, but the rebellion was crushed. Tejanos who demanded equality were declared bandits by the state government, hunted down, killed, or even lynched. Tejanos therefore retreated into their own communities with their families and churches to be by themselves, for themselves, under their own norms and traditions, usually again under a patron. Right up to the 1970s, if you ran for political office in Texas, like Lyndon Johnson, and wanted what became in the American colloquial known as the Hispanic vote, you didn't campaign for it, but had a phone call with the patron. However, this segregation, dispossession, and consequent isolation that extended beyond Texas to Mexican American communities up to California also had a different effect. Mexican Americans organized around their communities. They took care of each other, helped each other, built socio-economic institutions of their own, took care of each other through family and church, and as a community separated and disenfranchised, learned to rely upon others within their own community to organize together. There is a good reason for when desegregation finally came, why Mexican American communities were able to organize efficiently, run labor unions, organize political action communities, and gain and achieve political representation faster than many other historically disenfranchised minority communities within the United States. Despite all hardships that they endured, there was a perseverance and strength that they found within community structures. It wasn't until the opening of American society, desegregation, and the integration of the political process that the Norteños re-emerged back into the general public, as well as the cultural and political stage. And it wasn't until recent years that Texan historians began to seriously and honestly examine their true history. Juan Seguin, the hero of the Battle of San Jacinto, may not have his name in the Wikipedia article of that battle yet, but public buildings across Texas are increasingly named after him. And the State Library and Archive was named after Lorenzo de Zavala. The stories of the Texan Norteños, or Tejanos, raise interesting questions about the state and history of Texas in particular. They rebelled to be free from the tyranny and despotism of a Mexican dictatorship, and were then betrayed by those who wanted to keep slaves. So are Tejanos maybe even more Texan than those who rebelled to keep slaves? They have been around longer than the American settlers by 4 centuries, some of them being the descendants of settlers who came 100 years before the first English settled in Virginia. The only ones who predate them are the Apaches. The history of the Tejanos, Californios, and the Norteños of Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and Nevada also are in general one of the most interesting chapters in the history of what we call Manifest Destiny. The story of Manifest Destiny frequently is told in context of Americans taking land from native Indians, which is true, but often overlooks the important chapter of the land stolen from Mexicans after a betrayal. We should not forget that the Norteños rebelled against Mexico, from Coahuila to Texas to Sonora to Baja California, Arizona, New Mexico, and California. That many of them wished to overthrow Santa Anna or even to secede from Mexico itself and form something new. When Mexicans are reminded of the Alamo by some rather uneducated Americans, it is worth pointing out that Mexicans were amongst the rebels at the Alamo. That the cultural narrative often found in popular history of Americans and Mexicans destined to be enemies is actually untrue, and that they may have more in common than you may think at first. To tell that story, one will have to immerse oneself into the Mexican and Norteño perspective of the history of these states and ask those questions and answers that we might examine closer in a future video. What matters for us here is that the Norteños formed a cultural parcel of the United States, not completely Mexican, as they were separated from that and molded over centuries into the American socio-political cultural framework, but not fully part of the Anglo-majority cultural set in America, as they shared a culture with Norteños across the border. But they also differ from last century's Mexican migrants in culture a lot, especially from those that came from southern Mexico. They show us one thing predominantly, that when you boil it down to basics, there is rarely such a thing as a cultural border. Borders are drawn by states, by governments, by government institutions, and not by cultures. And when this border was drawn, it fell into a time of extreme political friction. Post-Texan independence, Mexico was even a greater shambles. Inspired by the Texas example, more rebellions arose all across the Norteño lands in declarations of independence. The Republic of Rio Grande, the Republic of Baja California, the Republic of Sonora, and even down south in the Republic of Yucatan. After Santa Anna refused to make peace with Texas, that had by now bankrupted itself, and with New England and the Midwest settlers inciting rebellion in California, the United States seized the opportunity and, after winning a decisive victory, annexed large parts of northern Mexico, moving the border to where it now divides Nogales and follows the flow of the Rio Grande. However, the United States stopped short from annexing Sonora, Coahuila, and Baja California, even though they could have, and even though American mercenaries were involved in the rebellions there. Because fundamentally, this annexation was the result of a compromise. This chapter in the history book is one of those what-if chapters. The Americans could have drawn the border further south. They could have annexed all the rebelling republics, and the modern United States would have extended all the way down the Sierra Madre Mountains. Maps from that era show how this was in fact even considered. Instead, they didn't, and the remaining rebellions were crushed. The reason for this lies within the preeminent internal political conflict of the United States at the time. The conflict between the slave states south and the free states of New England. Opposition to the Mexican-American War and its annexations came from New England.
Who believes that a score of victories over Mexico, the annexation of half our provinces, will give us more liberty, a purer morality, a more prosperous industry than we have now? Murder cannot be hidden from God by a few flimsy rags called banners. Awake and arrest the work of butchery, where it shall be too late to preserve your souls from the guilt of wholesale slaughter.
Asked the prominent Massachusetts abolitionist and newspaper owner Horace Greeley, and the Massachusetts State Senate voted to condemn the Mexican-American War as
a war against freedom, against humanity, against justice, with the triple objective of extending slavery or obtaining the control of the free states.
And that was in the end true. The president at the time, James Polk, was a Southerner whose political loyalties lied with the Southern states that had long called for this war. Mississippi Senator John Quitman had called for an invasion of Mexico when Mexico abolished slavery to
prevent the establishing of a Negro and mongrel empire.
Southern legislators and representatives had long yearned to expand slavery in what they called the Golden Circle, which by 1854 became an organization called the Knights of the Golden Circle, a precursor to a certain other organization beginning with the letter K. They advocated for an annexation of the entire Mexican Gulf Coast, right down to Yucatan, enslaving its non-white inhabitants, and to then go to war with Spain to annex Cuba and Hispaniola, all of which should become new slave states, filled with slave plantations, to expand and create a slave empire along the Gulf of Mexico, a golden circle of slave states stretching all around the Gulf of Mexico, hence the name. In 1854, when Spain abolished slavery, the Louisiana State Senate passed a motion that
condemning the abolition of slavery in Spanish Cuba and the sacrificing of the white race.
The southern states made no secret of the fact that they wished to expand so they could expand slavery. New England feared this and was terrified by the idea. It would double the slave states in the United States, and consequently the amount of slave state representatives in Senate, Congress, and electoral votes. Slave state legislators would have dominated the United States government. Consequently, the free states had a staunch opposition to any and all annexation of any Mexican lands. However, this was a little bit hypocritical. New England also expanded west and eventually into Mexican lands to gain more free states and hence political power over the slave states. At the same time, California was increasingly settled by people from the Midwest in the east and from New England along the coast. Although those two groups had not much in common, they both deplored and despised slavery, and California would also provide access to the Pacific, which the slave states could also benefit from. There are two things, however, that made Californian settlement different from Texas settlements. Despite what some Californians may tell you, there really wasn't much of a Californian independence movement or revolution. California's separation from Mexico was almost completely driven by the United States federal government, who immediately annexed it when the opportunity came. The other fact is that the New Englanders and Midwesterners who migrated there didn't manage to fully transplant their socio-political framework upon California as Southern planters did in Texas. Within years of annexation, gold rushes attracted hundreds of thousands of migrants from Chile to Argentina to Germany, Sweden and Ireland, Japan, Korea and China, Turkey, Jamaica and India. The population of California became incredibly diverse, where no one cultural group could dominate over all others, and the way society was run had to accommodate for all. The influx of immigrants also generated capital that fueled industrial development in sectors such as railroads, steel, manufacturing, farming, shipping, and more. In New England political culture, the well-being of the community had priority over the well-being of the individual, as it had developed out of Puritan English culture. But in California, the influx of migrants and the growth of industry through migrant groups, as well as the import of more cultures, resulted in individual freedoms taking a more prominent position on the stage as common values. Community values in California tended to be centered around groups of communities and churches, be they Mexican-American farmer communities, Japanese farmers, Argentinian miners, Irish and American harbor workers, or Chinese railroad workers. California politically aligned itself with New England, but socio-politically developed very differently. Racial segregation, as implemented in Texas, was attempted but less rigorously enforced and eventually collapsed. Mexican culture and Catholicism persevered to mix and mold with English culture and the various new arrivals into something unique and new, while the Latinos of Texas remained mostly as they were. The Tejanos were segregated and consequently preserved much of their communal structures. In contrast to that, the Californios participated within the socio-political framework of the American society that formed. They helped reshape it throughout the coming century, but also themselves became a lot more American. California in the end became a mixed patchwork of cultures mixed together in a pioneer society. With no dominant cultural group, it needed to build a political structure that appealed to all. It became the place you went to start a new life, not just if you were American, but from anywhere in the world. A place more tolerant than most other parts of the country, which would therefore in its own regard significantly shape the United States. And while the Free States worked on bringing California into the Union, strategically the Free States also came to agree to an annexation of Texas as a slave state as part of a compromise. Texas to them seemed worthless, a scrap of desert with some parts where weird black liquid that stank of sulfur pierced through the sand. So nothing too valuable, but as a desert, perfect as a protective buffer zone to protect Louisiana and its New Orleans port, which, as the mouth of the Mississippi River, was the Achilles heel of the 19th century American economy. With annexation, an invader would have to take the long, difficult march through a hostile desert filled with Apaches and angry Southerners to get there. And unlike Mexico, the United States had another advantage that contributed to these annexations happening. For centuries, Spaniards and Mexicans had struggled with the difficult geography of the Chaparral. Attempts to enforce their state structures upon the region had failed miserably. The Spanish state had not the means to do so, and the Mexican state, which had inherited much of its political and economic structures from Spain, was too weak to do so either. But for the Americans and their state structure that had developed from the 1600s onward, which allowed for a more decentralized government structure, it was more possible. The geography of the Chaparral was and still is to this very day difficult for any society and state to control, but the institutions of the state that had developed in the United States made it easier for her to do so than for Mexico. This, together with the expansions driven by manifest destiny and the drive by free states and slave states to expand their political power, in the end would form the basis for a political compromise between those two rival factions within the US government. California would be annexed as a future free state, and to get access to the Pacific, and Texas as a future slave state that protected Louisiana as a strategic buffer. The border that today separates Mexico from the United States was not drawn by culture, language, geography, religion, ethnicity, or even just as conquest spoils of war. It was drawn as a compromise between two rival political camps in an attempt to prevent a civil war. A civil war that in the end happened anyway. Throughout the first 2 chapters of this series, we focused on one thing. I attempted to show you how the founding structures of the United States and Mexico were different and consequently resulted in the evolution of 2 very different political structures. On the North American East Coast, a gradual but ever-increasing attitude of rebellion, autonomous community structures, financial self-interest and separatism came to shape the political structures of the United States. While in the plateau of Mexico and most of Latin America, the Spanish Empire successfully established a state and social structures of a feudal society that existed in the Spanish motherland. That Europeans sought to replicate European feudalism in the Americas, and where they succeeded, a feudal social structure with all its legacies came to be. However, those carefully watching might have encountered a flaw within the case I am building. That being, if feudal structures leave legacies that create broken political institutions, then why are the state institutions of Europe not as broken as those of Mexico? The answer to that is exactly why the Mexican state is in its current state: destruction and decline. Destruction is not exactly something that we would associate with stability or the establishment of a stable political and social order, more with the kind of environment that produces war and thereby allows stateless entities to shape and take control. However, it is chaos, war, destruction, and decline that ultimately shaped the modern political institutions of Europe. The feudal political order of Europe started being challenged in 1789 and 1803, and even though it was re-established in 1815 by the feudal powers, it kept getting challenged over and over and over again. The existent political powers eventually dragged Europe into an apocalyptic catastrophe, which caused the collapse of most old European political structures. The result of this collapse was a volatile landscape of political instability from which a political force emerged which completely burnt down any remnants of old European political power structures. The Europe of 1945 was a Europe that needed to be rebuilt, not just physically by rebuilding destroyed infrastructure, cities, towns, and industry, but also in governance and state structure. The political structures were reinvented, and ironically, it would be American Republican political structures, the ones that were birthed out of rejecting European feudal structures, which would lead the leading role in rebuilding how Europe does politics. What was born from this were more stable, open, accountable, just and free political structures. States that provided a level playing field for commerce and the development of open political discourse and public sovereignty. But there is an exception in Europe. A state untouched by the apocalyptic events that rendered Europe to ashes. A state that remained outside of the consequent rethinking and rebuilding of Europe. A state that gives you an idea of what happened to Mexico because its recent political developments have been somewhat similar to Mexico. Spain. Spain went through all the political turmoil that the rest of Europe experienced, but it stayed out of the final apocalypse, instead opting for its own smaller apocalypse, a war won by the forces of old Europe, who then proceeded to try and create a weird, romanticized, nostalgic yet modernized vision of an old Spain, however with none of the charm, a disregard for culture, brutal totalitarianism, an economy dependent on a wealthy class that almost resembled 19th century European aristocrats, and deep institutional corruption. This disheveled tumor on the Spanish history book eventually collapsed into itself, but the structures of this Spanish state, the way governance used to be done within it, still partially remain and haunt Spain to this very day, in corruption, lack of public accountability, regional instability, nepotism, and calamitous economic decisions resulting from backdoor deals. Something that is colloquially known in Europe as the ghost of Franco. The diarrhea that you get if you drink tap water in Mexico is colloquially known as Montezuma's Revenge, a somewhat superstitious and funny name invoking the ghost of the long-gone Aztec emperor returning to haunt those who now inhabit his lands. But in a way, it is true. The failure of the Mexican state to provide even basic sanitation systems for large parts of the country's water supply network is the result of a legacy of centuries of corrupt practices and failed states. You could call it the ghost of Santa Anna, the ghost of Diaz, or the ghost of the PRI. What it, however, shares with the ghost of Franco is that Mexico, just as Spain, never underwent a period of restructuring its state and completely abandoning the old, corrupt, outdated, and inefficient ways. The first rebellion of the Mexican War for Independence was the Hidalgo Revolt, an uprising of disenfranchised peasants led by a priest, primarily not against Spain but against the tyranny of the colonial elites. The colonial elites crushed the revolt only to then fight for independence against Spain because Spain wanted to cut down on their ability to rule as small tyrants. Mexico was left in ruins, but it was the tyrants who rebuilt the new independent Mexico. But Mexico also had other chances. It had more cataclysmic events that left the country in ruins and could have resulted in a rebuilding and rethinking of the Mexican state into a less corrupt, more democratic and just entity. The end of the Mexican-American War, the Reform Wars, the end of the French occupation and the revolution in 1910. But it blew all of these chances. Every time it ended up being the forces of old who dictated that the future was the past. Let's return to where we were. While the Americans were annexing Texas and California, the Europeans were licking their wounds after decades of revolutions and wars. They had also lost considerable revenue from the loss of colonies in the Americas. The new world that they had intended and used as a cash cow was increasingly slipping out of their fingers. And when the Mexican Republic refused to pay debts to the French and Spanish, it seemed like a perfect opportunity to reassert and rebuild influence over the Americas. Since Mexico was also a weak state that had just come out of a costly war, it seemed like a perfect target. The French invaded Mexico and placed an Austrian monarch on the throne of a state with a god-awful and complicated flag to draw. The French were supported in this endeavor by all major European powers who wished to rebuild a European sphere of influence over the Americas again. However, what the Europeans overlooked was that if the Mexican state had difficulty running Mexico, well, what made them think that they could somehow do it? Additionally, very few actually wanted the European overlords back. There were some supporters of the Mexican monarchy, especially amongst the Mexican elite, but other than that, only the Confederacy and a dying Brazilian monarchy supported this French puppet monarchy. The Republican Mexican army fought hard throughout the land, and even though the French managed to occupy many major cities, they got bogged down in the guerrilla war in the countryside, and could, just as those who preceded them, never establish any control over the north, where the Norteños had zero interest in being told by the French what to do. In fact, the capital of Mexico during the occupation was there, in Ciudad Juárez. The Americans were also furious. They even considered entering the war on the side of Mexico to kick the French out, but were preoccupied with their own war, which didn't prevent them from providing aid and encouraging American volunteers to go south and fight the French, which several thousand did. In the end, France lost, which Mexicans commemorate to this day on Cinco de Mayo, the anniversary of the first major defeat of the French 5 years before the war ended. This is a chapter unjustly underrepresented in modern history curriculum. It is an important turning point. This marked the final end of European geopolitical and colonial ambitions in the Americas. More than just a Mexican victory, it can be seen as a victory for the entire family of American nations to have the right to determine their own future and destiny without European interference, and making it very clear at the time that the borders of European imperialism ended on the coastlines of the two American continents. The first Cinco de Mayo celebrations, by the way, were held in California, years before the war was over, by Americans in solidarity with Mexico and collecting donations and volunteers to send south to Mexican Republican forces. Europe, at the end of the war, went back home and then proceeded to take its frustrations out on Africa and themselves. What they had left in Mexico was devastation, but also a newfound optimism. Relations with the United States had been eased out, and past conflicts settled in diplomatic agreement. The two nations agreed to friendship and cooperation as American aid was sent to help rebuild the Mexican economy. It was at this point that history could have gone a different way, that the state structures of Mexico could have been rebuilt differently. But that didn't happen. Instead, what happened was the Porfiriato, named after Porfirio Diaz, a hero of the war against France who became president in 1884. Diaz rebuilt the Mexican economy by expropriating vast amounts of land, seizing it from mostly poor mestizo peasants in the south and handing it over to large landowners. This had a substantial impact on this sector of the Mexican economy. Throughout various, often hard-to-access regions of Mexico, small family farms had established themselves over the centuries, self-sufficient farmers who mainly produced for their own needs, sharecroppers who provided for themselves and paid to local authorities taxes and shares of the harvest, or tenant farmers who paid to a large landlord for the privilege. Irrespective of which type of farm and if they had owned their land or not, these small family farms were disbanded, and the new owners of these lands created plantation economies, henequen plantations that produced fibers for rope, sorghum to be used as cattle feed, coffee for a global demand that exploded during the late 19th century, and sugarcane to produce sugar or rum and foodstuffs. What all of these crops had in common was that they cannot be produced as a family crop. These highly labor-intensive crops require the kind of substantial investment in capital and labor that a small family farm cannot bring up. These plantations were also part of a global economy, and most of its products were to be sold into the foreign markets of an increasingly global and industrialized economy. The vast majority of these plantations were created in the south as jungle plantations, meaning jungles roaded to use the fertile soils and hot climate for multiple annual harvests. However, there's a rough lesson to be learned by anyone who invests into these types of jungle plantations and ranches. A lesson that West African countries and Central American countries learned the hard way, and a lesson that Brazil should have learned in the 19th century, but under its current leadership seems to be determined to learn again. Jungles are not random depositories of nutrition. Jungles are fragile, self-sustaining ecosystems working in a constant cycle of recyclement. Rotting trees and dead leaves constantly fertilize the wealth in the fauna that itself furthers the continuous rainfall. Road the jungle and you destroy that cycle. When building your ranch or plantation on the remaining fertile soil, you are bound to get some years of very rich results. But with the cycle broken, you will run out of nutritious soil, and eventually you will have to spend an enormous amount of the profits made into fertilizer. Consequently, jungle plantations end up becoming a cycle within themselves, a self-sustaining poverty institution that keeps entire segments of populations trapped in low-income, low-skill, yet labor-intensive jobs with little innovation, from the Gold Coast to the jungles of Central America. The only way you can continuously run the jungle plantation and still rake in massive profits is by continually roading more jungle or by having unpaid labor. With the institution of slavery, Caribbean plantations racked in gigantic profit margins, and to ensure enormous profits, Diaz went by similar means. Dispossessed small farmers, mostly mestizo, ended up working for close to nothing or nothing as indentured servants, debt laborers, penal laborers, or sometimes even just kidnapped and forced to work in a new, industrialized but still exploitative plantation industry. The low point of this economic practice came when Diaz forcibly dispossessed the native Yaqui people who had lived largely untouched in the northern state of Sonora. Not only did they have their lands taken, but almost the entire people, around 8,000 of them, were deported to the southern state of Yucatan and forced to work as slaves on plantations in a supposedly civilizing forced labor system, eerily similar to that of the Spanish missions built 2 centuries before. This started a gradual change in the prosperity and balance of wealth of the nation. The South became dominated by rich plantations, which gave the illusion of the average wealth rising throughout the South, but in reality the South started becoming poorer and poorer due to the massive population of impoverished farm laborers that worked these plantations. It is argued by some that the Porfiriato made Mexico wealthier due to an increase in GDP, But as this policy and others clearly show, it made Mexico poorer, as GDP can increase while the wealth and average living standards of average citizens does not, or even declines. Diaz also handed out these plantations as monopolies to his close allies and friends in the Mexico City business and political elite. Additionally, he handed out large monopolies in mining and other economic sectors to his political allies. The new industrial Mexico would mainly produce raw materials for foreign industrial markets. It meant that Mexico would spend the Industrial Revolution serving those who actually underwent that economic revolution, rather than revolutionizing its own economy. Licenses for banks were also monopolized and handed out to the political allies and friends of Diaz, with long-lasting and very damaging effects on the Mexican economy. Banks and the capital that they provide are essential for any economy to grow and for innovations to receive the backing required to be sold and produced. However, because the banks were in the hands of a small elitist group, they ended up serving a completely different purpose. The owners of the economic monopolies ended up borrowing from the banks that they owned themselves. They controlled interest rates, ensuring their own wealth while bankrupting those who came up as competition. The Mexican banking sector became intertwined within the politics of the country as a tool of unelected politicians to secure their own power and wealth, and a weapon to destroy those who challenge them and to keep this new status quo going. By 1910, there were only 40 banks in Mexico, many of which were controlled by political allies and friends of Diaz, ensuring a monopoly and capital that only they had and could grant access to. To take part in a global industrialized economy also takes access to foreign markets. Therefore, Diaz ended the restrictions on trade with foreign countries and in foreign markets, so his new economy could export its raw materials to a booming foreign set of industries. However, not only were the owners of the monopolies the only ones who really produced anything for this global economy, they were also the only ones given exclusive trading licenses to conduct this trade. In terms of laws and accountability, just as previous presidents, Diaz had not been elected, but seized power through force and fraud. He had the ability to change laws at his heart's content, to pardon or just outright legalize the cronyisms of his allies and himself, in particular through the use of a law called Recurso de Amparo. This law, based in the Mexican Constitution and originating in 1857, means appeal for protection, and essentially provides the basis for an individual to argue that certain laws don't apply to them because those laws may violate their constitutional rights, even though the Constitution might not even explicitly or implicitly protect what they claim to be a right as a right. This is confusing, and it was introduced in Mexico as a supposed protection for individuals against the state, and copied throughout many Latin American countries. But throughout Latin America, but especially in Mexico and Colombia, this law ended up being used by corrupt politicians and gangsters alike to escape prosecution and investigation through obfuscating the legal process with obscure arguments over obscure rights supposedly violated when their activities and persons were being investigated. In short, crooked business, corruption, and criminal activity in Mexico by state officials and wealthy elites through this not only ended up being state-sanctioned, but legally protected. Compare this to the economic developments taking place throughout the United States at the same time. The American banking sector was born into scandal and fraud, established, just like in Mexico, by politicians in collaboration with the wealthy to enrich themselves. However, a substantial difference to Mexico is that politicians involved in such scandals got voted out. Engaging in this type of corruption became increasingly risky as an American civil society expanded and developed. Banking was also not monopolized. Banks were created by private firms and persons throughout the country without approval by the state. In 1818, there were 338 banks in the United States. By 1910, there were 27,000, expanding both capital and its availability to average Americans. If you wanted a loan to start a business in the United States, you could get that loan very easily, and this availability of capital would do wonders for the American Industrial Revolution. If you had an innovation and needed the capital to build the capacity to produce and sell your product, you could do so. The reasons for this are found in the patent law system of English law. In 1623, the English Parliament passed a Patent Act, which stripped the English king of the power to grant royal patents and monopolies. Grounded in English law was now the ability for people to be granted patents by public representatives, laws that also shaped American laws and remained within American laws long after independence. Unlike in Mexico, you didn't need to plead with the state to be granted the privilege of doing business. You had that right, and you could additionally demand from your government to protect your rights from being violated by others. If you had an idea, you could patent that idea at a low cost and then sell that patent to some other corporation or company to receive more capital to then continue creating more patents for more innovations to then use your capital to build and expand your business. In the United States, the existing socio-economic and political structures meant that it could fully, not just as a state and society, but through the efforts of its citizens, participate in the Industrial Revolution and drive it onward into eventually becoming its leading nation. The only exception in the United States was a place developing into a similar economic direction as Mexico at the time, which was the South, where despite the abolition of slavery, a black population was held in indentured servitude, where they, despite developing some of their own economic infrastructure by and large, remained an underclass in a corrupt elitist society, and where innovation and economic development struggled to take hold until very recently. In contrast to the United States, in Mexico, the socio-economic and political structures of colonial Spain that were adapted into a republic now adapted again to find space within the Industrial Revolution and to continue. However, as the elites of Mexico City prospered and schemed, discontent amongst average Mexican citizens started to increasingly boil beneath the surface and would eventually blow up into a full-blown revolution. In the next video, we will talk about the Mexican Revolution, how the PRI created a corrupt state and broken economic structures, and how trade and border relations between the United States and Mexico developed until today, and its implications for the future. If you want to see it, don't forget to subscribe. If you want to support this channel and keep videos like these coming up, you can support me via Patreon, via PayPal, or via Ko-fi. Links to them, as well to all of my social media, will be in the description. I would like to thank the artists for contributing artwork to this video. Proceeds made with the Surfshark VPN sponsorship will in their entirety go to them. Many thanks to the Korean artist Teabag, the Turkish artist Turkbud, who is also open for commissions, the Mexican artist Nomad Star, who also has a YouTube channel, the Norwegian artist Pile of Trash, the German artist Tanit, the American artist Echo, who is also open for commissions, the Brazilian artist Felipe, who is also open for commissions, the Turkish artist Alpmapper, who also runs a YouTube channel, the Chilean artist Flying Tonk, the history YouTuber Vexy's Fear, the American artist Jikuzen, the Malaysian artist Mrs. Human Car, Porkbun, and Axotolos. You will find links to their social media in the description, and I highly recommend you check them out, especially if you need a piece of art commissioned. But also in particular Nomad, since I will be working with him on a 3-hour-long video project on the history of Quebec, which you will be able to find on his YouTube channel. I would also like to thank a group of YouTubers who came forward to read quotes for this video. Janie Bell, who makes comedy videos, Hades Vadim, who makes political commentary videos, Jangle Science Lad, who makes science videos and political commentary videos, and Pata History, a very underrated history YouTuber from Sri Lanka, whose channel is dedicated to telling the history of Sri Lanka. That's it. I hope you liked the video. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you all soon again for the next video.